science can contribute to improve the livelihoods of people and rural Scotland, and made several benefactions to Scottish agricultural projects, including the benefaction of land in Aberdeen to create an institute in Scotland. And his dream was to have what he called a Rothamsted of the North in Scotland. And we have that institute in Scotland today, and it's now evolved into the James Hutton Institute. And the Macaulay Development Trust still celebrates the legacy of that benefaction, and I'd like to acknowledge the great support and help we get from the Macaulay Development Trust at the James Hutton Institute. And what you'll see is the fruits of that investment upstairs in the lobby in the form of fellowships and students who are working on a wide range of problems which tackle the very difficult problems that the world faces. And I'd like to encourage you to engage with our fellows and our students when you enjoy something to drink and eat later. And also for the online audience, you can also engage. We have a facility on the online YouTube channel for you to post questions, and we'll make sure those questions get fed through to the discussion. So you're very much part of this. We want you to engage. We're also going to have a panel discussion and an opportunity for you to ask questions. I think I'd like to just again make reference to the fact that it is actually Climate Week, and many of you will have been involved in several events that are on this week, and it's Climate Week as a way of celebrating our contribution to tackling climate change and reflecting on how well we're doing it or how well we think we're not doing it. And I would argue, I've always argued that Scotland has been very, very progressive in this area. You know, we have ambitious targets in our climate change policies. And I always refer to the land use strategy as being the only land use strategy that I've seen in the world, and I think it's a very progressive document. Now, we can see now that there are other nations who are starting to stretch the ambitions even further, but actually it's not one single policy that matters, it's the combination of different policies that matter. And I think Scotland still does lead in a way of actually linking different policies towards this common aim of living in a much more sustainable world. And the Scottish Government do fund research in this area that the James Hutton and the Safari Institutes contribute to. And that research underpins many of these policies and gives us confidence about our predictions about the future, but also challenges and asks questions about the direction we're going into. And I think we all benefit from having that good relationship. Now I'd like to move on to talk about our lecturer, Jackie, and I really can't think of a better lecturer than Jackie to talk to about a global perspective and how things look from the top and the bottom up. Now, Jacqueline is from a discipline perspective a marine biologist and an environmental informatician, but she's also very interdisciplinary, I would suggest, and very interdisciplinary in practice. She's currently Professor of Resilience and Sustainable Development at the University College London, Institute for Global Prosperity, and Professor and Director of the Sekenani Research Centre of the Masai Mara University in Kenya. She was also Executive Director of the European Environment Agency from 2003 to 2013, and between 2014 and 2017 she was Chief Scientist and Director of the Science Division of the United Nations Environment Programme based in Nairobi. I think you'll agree that is very much a top-down view that we can benefit from. She also has a grounded view, and she in fact is married to a Maasai chief in Kenya. And as part of that, she has a very big responsibility for everyone in her community and is doing amazing work in building new infrastructure and meeting basic needs informed by science. Now, her Maasai name is Nasirian, and which means peace bringer. And the Maasai only give you a name after they have observed you, and they make sure they give you a name that you deserve. So I think you should be very complimented by that particular name. And this perspective from the ground also means we have a unique combination of somebody who's operated in the highest levels of science and policy, but is also very grounded and can take a bottom-up view. So without further ado, Jackie, I'd like to invite you to give the 41st TB Macaulay Lecture and invite you to the floor.
So good evening, everybody, and good evening, everybody who's watching online, including Africa and all the other places where I know they are. It's a great pleasure to come back because I actually am the only lecturer who's been asked back twice. Now, that may be a good or a bad thing, but anyway, here I am for a second time. So let me very quickly get on, because I want to cover some material, quite a lot of material in the time allocated. So the title, Natural Prosperity, you may be thinking, oh no, not another title, Prosperity Without Growth, blah, blah, blah. But what I want to talk about is, having seen sort of from the bottom up and the top down, just what the Connect could be, to look to nature for solutions, and ask some of the questions, well, why aren't we doing that? So I have this subtitle, Innovative Solutions for a Business Unusual Approach, and by that I mean we're going to be looking into very different avenues to find the answers to solve some of the global problems. Now, many of you will be very familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them. One of the challenges we have, of course, is that we haven't genuinely done the calculus of if you fulfill one of them, you might cancel out something else in another one. And so there's a huge amount of effort now going on looking at synergies, co-benefits, all the phrases you would definitely find within the academic world. But I ask the simple question, can we find business approaches? Can we find community approaches? What is the approach that makes sure that for the one effort you make, that you actually achieve multiple outcomes? And that's behind the thinking of many things that we do, both in the African context, but I think more and more when we're talking about the circular economy and we're talking about sustainable food systems, this is really where we need to focus. How can we get multiple beneficial outcomes from acting in a particular way? And what are the disadvantageous outcomes? What are the disadvantages of certain pathways, policy pathways, different kinds of technologies, which might actually undo progress in other areas? Now, we start from, I think, in this part of the world, a very, very good basis. You could say that you're privileged, you live in a relatively clean environment, but around the world, environmental degradation is genuinely a killer, and on a grand scale. It's a silent killer in some cases, it's certainly pervasive, but it is doing an extremely good job at taking out more than we would like. So on average, some non-communicable diseases, but in the broadest sense, many of them are environmentally determined. Estimates go up as high as 12 million a year. That does include disasters, risks and floods and so on. However, it's a large number and something that one has to do something about. So I'm just going to show you a very short clip from a film I made a few years ago, because it really goes to the heart of why do we see in some parts of the world so much environmental degradation. Please.
The challenge of the future, whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not, whether it's a policy or not, is making sure that we utilize resources more efficiently. If we don't do that, we hit resource depletion limits.
Priority number one should be to use our waste, because in an ideal society there should be no waste, because waste should be considered as a potential resource.
Today's so-called development model is completely unsustainable. It's unsustainable because it ignores the costs to nature.
Over the last century, we have more or less tenfold increased the extraction of resources.
Today's reality has exposed just how inefficient and dysfunctional the global economy has become. We need to rethink the way we live and act on this planet. Thank you. So, by the way, you can download this film. It's free and you can download it, and it actually won a prize at the Cannes Film Festival, so clearly somebody was watching. But the thing that we were trying to convey in that film was everywhere we looked, there was a lack of joined-up thinking. Yes, there was a lot of rhetoric and policies around the circular economy, some great business unusual approaches, but they weren't getting traction because they physically and also politically didn't have the weight of the argument. And that's really our biggest challenge. How do we convince people that they need to maybe change what they think and what we consider to be a prosperous world? So some of the work that we're doing around various places, Beirut, in London, now in Kenya, is to really think about what is prosperity. In fact, it's the flip side of deprivation. So if you go to East London and you talk to people about why do they feel deprived, they'll often talk about 0-hour contracts, lack of security in the house, and no community. If you then go a salami slice over and you find a community that's actually with the same conditions, living and food and so forth, but they have a community, their level of deprivation in terms of the household surveys is much, much lower. So one of the things that I have been examining then is saying, okay, we're beginning to get the seeds of what prosperity is all about, but it's more than that, because in a sense, we're talking about the whole way in which pervasively we create fulfilling lives from a social, from an economic, but now from an environmental perspective. So the thesis I'm trying to put forward is that natural prosperity, that in a depth linkage between humans and nature, is essentially what we need to bring back up to the surface, and that is what we have to work with to create prosperous societies. Interestingly, this is not. Now, as always, I don't come from nowhere. I have huge respect for many of these people, and I hope that some of you are familiar with the writers who are here. Of course, Rousseau started out. Colleagues of mine, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, who wrote The Spirit Level. They have a new book out called The Inner Level. It's very interesting. Of course, Herman Daly, who then did some work with Bob Costanza, who was a previous speaker here, another lecturer. And then, of course, the famous Stiglitz and Fitoussi book on the price of inequality. John Rawls, wonderful work around the theory of justice. And then, of course, Michael Marmot. So this is a kind of range of people who have got views that are genuinely taking the argument forward, certainly worth a few weeks of reading. And what they come to as a deep conclusion is that prosperity is actually not about money. It's very little to do with money. To feel prosperous is to have so many other attributes functioning for you. So, oh dear, I don't seem to be able to do this. Okay. So I'm going to basically play out the idea of natural prosperity, talking to that relationship between humans and nature, and in particular talking about the interdependency of well-being and wealth and what it takes to have that delivered to you through a well-functioning set of ecosystems. Now that can mean, of course, clean air, clean water, certainly vital things if you're living in the bush in Africa and various other places, but it's also about sustaining and actually helping the local prosperity as well as creating a global prosperity marker. How do we measure it? Well, of course, I'm not sure my clicker's working. Is it actually doing the job? Oh, yes, it is. Oh, no, right. Oh, too quick. Right. Oh, there we go. Right. Okay, so now one of the challenges we have is that many of us don't live very close to nature. Yes, we have a wonderful environment here in Scotland, but there are many who live in urban environments and feel a long way away from nature. But to be quite honest, it's very deep in our psyche and also in our genome about how close we are to nature. And I'm going to try and peel back some of those layers as I go through this evening's talk. But just to introduce, this is my family. I'm standing here on the left-hand side, so my husband in the middle, and then some of the young warriors from Tanzania. You can't get closer to nature than living in the Maasai. I have to tell you, I live in a mud hut. It is very close. It's all about mud management, actually. That's all that it's about. And there are many lesser-known factors, I have to tell you, of climate change, which is there's not enough cow dung from the cows. There's all sorts of things and difficulties, I tell you. However, it's the intensity of that relationship which has opened my eyes and my sort of scientific inquiry is to just how simple it is to consider natural prosperity as being the core of both well-being, of a prosperous future, and building resilience. And so by looking and studying very closely at how the traditions of the Maasai and then other tribes around me really prosper, I can see that through that stewardship of the environment, a very, very strong cognitive development, and something I'm going to come back to, is firmly set in place. And what is that? Well, it's all the executive powers. So although many tribes, and this is true for all parts of the world, may not have so much food as to consistently have sufficient, the way in which they put together the diet means that on the whole they will develop cognitively in a very good way. So I ask the question sometimes, it's not the size of the rations, it's the quality of the rations that we really have. And it's a deeply put together diet. So as we go through the talk tonight, I'll start to sort of peel back, what does that look like? So this is not just some kind of mythical setting, not some fantasy. This is real life. This is living on the edge and not necessarily having all of the security of a supermarket just down the road. What it does, though, it changes in a way the sense of social risk, and that interconnectedness with nature is tied up intrinsically with how you perceive risk, but also how you perceive and deal with stress, the stress of the past and the stress of the future. Now, the natural dependency is found in many, many places. And here, for example, is a hunter from Greenland. And it's a beautiful picture. I didn't take it, I have to tell you. It was a colleague of mine. He won the Pulitzer Prize for it. Oh, anyway, but I took the same shot standing next to him, but mine didn't win the Pulitzer Prize. Anyway, I swear I have no idea how he did it. But anyway, there he was. He took that photograph and it was on the front of all the newspapers the next day. But what you see is the hunter having shot the seal. This seal will then become the food for the family and for the dogs. But before he essentially does anything, he gives a prayer, I think, of thankfulness to the spirit. And it's this true respect for nature, which is a consistent message all the way through many indigenous peoples. So national prosperity talks about, well, how can we get that respect back? Because it's more than just a respect for animals. It's about the commonwealth and how the community itself relies upon nature, and a deep understanding, sometimes with science, often without, of actually what is going on and the dynamics that are going on inside the ecosystem. So without being able to articulate it in the form, let's say, of a mathematical equation, it is truly impressive to see how calculations of sustainability are done, often in an oral tradition, and come to the same answer as some of my modelling colleagues who spend several years doing the same thing. And in the end, it comes down to distributional policies. So having determined, in a way, what the natural resource is, of course, we come headlong into distribution. And one of the iniquities of life, particularly in the developed world, is how inequality, in the way that it has grown, has taken us not only away from the natural resources, but is causing a whole long tail of effects, such as impacts on health, mental health, and so forth. So, although Roosevelt knew and did as much as he could at the time, I think it still is a very poorly understood setting where we talk about how do we move on from gross domestic product, how do we move on from even natural capital accounting, which is sort of in the vogue. It's in a way, I mean, I was one of the sort of people who created the natural capital accounting and how to do it within the statistical offices. But in the end, it's a very limited view of how you will bring natural prosperity into being. It tells you about the assets. It tells you about the wealth of your ecosystems. And even if you don't monetize everything into an accounting framework, what it doesn't really tell you about is that interdependency and the linkages to human health and human well-being. So it's not also about willingness to pay for the services. So in the end, you ask yourself, well, what is it? What is it that natural prosperity could bring to the fore that would, in the end, I think, help us deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals and many, many other things? It's about fairness. It's about how we deal with things in and amongst the community, but also between ourselves and the governance structures. This is really not doing me very good favours here. Right, naturalist intelligence. Now, Howard Gardner had a very interesting book out where he looked at multiple intelligences. And on the whole, we're very familiar with most of them: mathematical, logical intelligence, emotional intelligence, and so forth. And one that is often forgotten is the natural intelligence, naturalist as he calls it. When you look at children, and he does enormous experiments in this field, and you see how they react to certain natural products and different objects, it shows you that they have, children particularly, have a very deep understanding and intuition about how nature actually works. And it's worth watching some of them online. Some of them are filmed, to a point where you think, really, childhood is the incantation of that deep naturalist intelligence, and what we tend to do is strip it all away as we put them through different educational systems. So how can we really tap back into that? What is it that we can bring back into our daily thinking that would help us to understand intuitively, but also factually, how to make best use of the natural world, and therefore build a prosperous economy on it? So I'm going to look at 4 big areas: climate change and prosperity. I'm going to look at sustainable food systems and what that means for food security. Building a circular economy. How do we use resources? How do we avoid the vicissitudes of the extractive industries? And then what is this business unusual approach? Because some have already got it. I give you one example. The chief executive from IKEA has announced that at least by 2030, every single product in every single store will have been made using local resources. Now that is quite a claim, because you come back to the idea of, right now, the economies of scale are what delivers IKEA. You know, you buy a cupboard and you pretty much know it's the same cupboard whether you're going to buy it in Germany, buy it in France, or wherever. But if you're really going to create products that have a seamless match all around and the same kind of brand, but you're going to use local resources, then you're going to have to be very creative about how you find those resources so that they essentially deliver up a similar looking product. Anyway, they have that in hand, and it's certainly something that's worth watching. So I'm going to start out, though, with a very simple premise. If you wanted to act today, on the whole, as a politician, we could say, generally speaking, you've got enough information to act. And broadly, that would be true. There are enough data coming in, there's enough information coming from different surveys to tell you the broad direction that would take you along a much more open and integrated and prosperous pathway. However, what we do see is that we need a far more sophisticated way of bringing data together. Combinatorial knowledge means that we understand how to blend small data, in other words, individual data, with big data, so that we don't make these vast assumptions about correlations just because we've got so much data. It looks like there's a line that you could draw. So combinatorial knowledge is as much about how you blend, in a way, your DNA with how you look, as how you have individual consumer choices and what is available on the store shelf. And what I'm seeing more and more is that people are almost saying, I'm just not going to do that. Particularly in the research community, there are very, very clear dividing lines starting to come up between people who want to engage with data and informatics and those who are simply saying someone else can do it. But I come back to this, that if you don't engage with data, you can't build the kind of combinatorial knowledge that you're going to need. And so one major challenge that we have is, how do we make not just the data accessible, but usable, fit for purpose? And that's where I think a whole generation of customization is going to be part of what we call Industry 4.0. So combinatorial is very important. We also need to think about the robustness of the statistics and indicators that we use. There's nothing worse than seeing a politician go out and make a vast, big statement, and then the number is wrong. Oh my goodness, I would never. Fortunately, it didn't happen to me, but I have seen it happen, and it's devastating. So check your numbers, make sure they're robust. But in the end, do you really want the world distilled down to one number? We are going to keep the planet to below 1.5 degrees centigrade pre-industrial levels. Well, if anyone heard me on the radio this morning, I'm slightly sceptical about that number. Anyway, but we do find it easy to have conversations in a coded way around single numbers. But again, it's the surround sound of those numbers that's going to be extremely important. It's the noise in the system that we need to deal with. Similarly, when we're talking about open data and citizen science, I'm one of the firmest believers of citizen participation and creating citizen science programs. I think they are phenomenally powerful when you want to elicit change. But you have to do them properly. You can't just simply put an application out there and hope that everyone's going to play along in the right way. They certainly won't all want to play by the rules, by the way, that's the other thing. So I think the world of data is upon us, and actually it's not really a realistic option to opt out. We have to engage with it because data is very powerful and it will be used to determine one pathway or another, Brexit or not Brexit, whatever. So, sit on your numbers and understand them. We are absolutely sitting on the cliff edge of more data than perhaps we could ever have imagined. And down the side, and behind the whole of this picture, you will see space missions. So I happen to do a lot of work in the space area, and I'm building a space research centre in the Rift Valley. And what do I find is that we have some of the most exciting space missions you can imagine that are going up. And I'm going to show you one in a minute. So if I talk to my colleagues, though, across the world, the vast majority of them say, I have absolutely no idea how to use the data. I don't even know how to get it. And yet it's all free, it's all openly available and accessible. So there is a missing gap. So I'm going to show you a very short film about one of the most exciting satellites that we just put up. It went up on August 23rd. It's called Aeolus. And it's very fitting. I want to show it to you today because the Nobel Prize was won for the work in lasers today, as you know. And this is a laser up in space. Took 20 years. It's the most complicated instrument I think we've ever put up. So I'll just show you a little film about a new satellite that's gone up, and then I'm going to tell you about the data that it's produced in the last 2 weeks. Please.
What's the wind doing when it's not blowing? Perhaps blowing somewhere else, over there maybe, or up there? Well, without the wind there would be neither weather nor a lot of other things. In ancient Greece, the god Aeolus caused the winds to blow across Europe. Later, the great seafarers took advantage of the strong trade winds to sail more quickly to the Caribbean. They also knew about the horse latitudes, the windless doldrums at the equator, and about the stiff westerlies in the North Atlantic that they used to sail back to Europe. Nowadays, aircraft use the jet stream around the pole to gain extra speed towards the east while avoiding them in the opposite direction. Wind is created when the heat of the sun causes the air in the tropics to rise and then move towards the poles. In between, the air moves in all directions due to warmer and colder spots and the uneven landscape. On top of this, the wind is also deflected by Earth's rotation. This is called the Coriolis force. This all leads to a constant intermingling of rising and falling drafts over cold, warm, flat and mountainous terrain, and is in effect the reason why the weather is so difficult to predict. Nowadays, meteorologists know quite a lot about wind in our atmosphere, about the invisible currents and streams pushing masses of air from here to there, from above to below, rising rapidly to descend again somewhere else. This is what gives us high and low pressure areas, tornadoes and storms. This is what brings us rain clouds and cloudless summer weather, at least in theory. Sometimes the wind is really noticeable, when flags flutter, when an aircraft wiggles, or when you could barely stand upright at top of a mountain. But wind is invisible, up to now. The European Space Agency ESA has built a satellite to measure winds from space in a new way. It'll help us understand winds better and make forecasts more accurate. Aeolus is the first research satellite that uses a laser to measure the wind all around the world. To do so, it sends a laser beam down into the atmosphere. The laser light hits the air molecules, ice crystals, and dust particles in the atmosphere, and a small portion of it is reflected and captured by the satellite's telescope. This allows the movement of the air to be measured continuously and comprehensively from 30 kilometers altitude all the way down to the ground. There's never been anything like this. It's no easy task. It took hundreds of engineers and scientists nearly 20 years to develop this one-of-a-kind instrument, but now it's finished and launched into orbit. Its data will revolutionize our understanding of the wind, because our knowledge about the wind and how it changes is not very accurate. For example, the jet stream's key role in summer weather, or the polar currents and their influence on the climate and on the extent of the ozone hole in winter. The winds over the oceans aren't measured everywhere, and the world's 13,000 weather stations on dry land are distributed unevenly. By measuring wind all over the globe, Aeolus fills this gap. It's not without reason that scientists around the world, weather reporters, climate researchers, wind turbine operators, shipping companies, aeroplane pilots, and countless other users are eagerly awaiting its first data.
So, I found it fantastic. I went to the launch of it. It was amazing in Mission Control. But within 2 weeks we had data, and already the data that's coming out of Darmstadt tells us that all of our thinking that we'd put into the modelling, even into the weather services, the forecasting, will have to be kind of rethought through. Now you'll be able to really anticipate storms, but more importantly, you'll be able to look much more carefully on a local scale about what is going to happen. Now, I'm not saying the weathermen are all going to be out of work, but it's very, very crucial now, if you're running a business, that you figure out how to use this. And so I can see more and more that these are the kinds of instruments that will transform how predictable the world is and what kinds of businesses will be able to, in a way, make best use of this. So I use that as an example to tell you, it's really not a good idea to put your head in the sand when it comes to finding out about the environment. And we have 5 more space missions that are going to give you information on a highly, highly disaggregated scale, down to 30 centimeters, on carbon, on soil moisture, on many, many attributes as to how the world is operating. So these are exciting times, and in a way, they're the kind of way that we should be thinking that you can empower people. And it doesn't matter whether you're a farmer in Kenya and you've had no education whatsoever, we can translate that into an app on a phone. But if we think about the 4 big areas that we would like to tackle looking at natural prosperity, one of them, of course, is nutritional, essentially food insecurity and poor nutrition. Another one is declining economic productivity. It's very clear that in Industry 4.0 there won't be a big production base bringing kind of natural resources into the economy as we've done in the past for the whole of the continent of Africa. It's going to be very, very different. Youth unemployment, shrinking economies. So what I'm saying is that the more we understand and know about the natural world, the more likely we're going to be able to tackle these 4 big problems. Because in the end, it is our natural resources that are the real fuel for how the economies are going to operate. So demand-led side is where we're seeing more and more requests to find out more and more, and then translating that into usable actions and policies is where the natural prosperity domain will lie. So when we look about the drivers of change and we think about natural prosperity, we get some rather disturbing messages. So if we look at the big 5 drivers, so population growth, urbanization, social and economic behavior, technology, and then of course climate change. Well, the question then is, how are we going to deal with these as we go forward? So let's just look at some of the numbers that come from that. If we look at demographics, and I've put some pictures from Scotland up, but this could be a story pretty much anywhere, we of course have the big global pictures that population growth will increase. There might be some discussion about whether or not it will be 10 billion and then 12 billion, but there will be more people on the planet Earth. What is, I think, still disturbing is that just on this small island of the United Kingdom, there's a 9-year difference in life expectancy in men and 7 in women between the best, the greatest and the least well-off areas. That's the same as between the UK and parts of India. It's the same as you might expect to see in parts of the ex-Soviet states. So these are big numbers, and they don't come about by chance. There's also a problem about health. So if you look at these figures, these are the latest figures from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, then you can see that there's a whole, what I would say, sort of degrading of life, depending on whether or not you have high or low education, and actually your status, whether you're single or in a couple. And I think some of these numbers are quite staggering. The fact that without a long-standing illness, between being single and in a couple, these are very, very large differences. I think what's even more worrying is what's happening to, and will happen in the future, according to nearly every person who looks at these data, about how many children are going to end up in households which will be below the poverty line. And it's not just to single out Scotland. We have the same problem in many parts of the United Kingdom. So what are we going to do? How are we going to address this? And one of the challenges, of course, is that this income inequality, which keeps coming back onto the table, is at its root, more often than not, linked to resource utilization, resource extraction. And there are many, many things that have been written. So this is the case for Scotland, but certainly in other parts of the world, Africa, for example, you often see that it's the large inequality in access to resources that puts people on the move, which then leads to a decline in life expectancy. So there's a whole cascade that comes along with either not having access to resources or not having access to enough of resources, or simply never getting the benefits of them. So loosening that grip between poverty and health is absolutely critical. But also, we're putting ourselves in the way of environmental harm. If we live in an urban area, and I mean, Edinburgh is still a beautiful city to live in, but most people don't have the benefit of living in such a clean environment. Most people live in these kinds of environments when you think about the urban centres of the world. And yet, most of us are going to end up living in cities in the coming decades. So not only will 90% of city growth occur in low-income countries where we just simply don't have capacity to create that clean environment, but worse still, it's going to have a whole load of money spent on it in terms of infrastructure. Now, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do a whole new job? Now, Egypt is doing that. It's building a new capital city and is essentially trying to build a green capital. But it's very difficult in most places to do that. So we're talking about retrofitting and trying to get a motivation from citizens to do different things. And so in Nairobi, for example, a lot of what you see from vehicles is because of fuel mixing. And the government's just put a 16% increase on fuel price. Now, imagine that, 16%. If they tried to do that here, you'd probably have a riot, right? 16%. So what does it do? Well, of course, it immediately affects the poorest people, number one. And second thing is you think, what can I mix with the fuel to make it go a bit longer? And of course, what you'll do is you'll go and get oil fat, you'll get all kinds of weird things, and then you get that. You get that is what you get. And it's like a no-brainer. You just understand exactly how people will react. So if I was honest, I would say that we're going to see a really, really difficult situation in cities like Nairobi as pressure is put on fuels because there's no public transport. There's no electric transport. There's no alternatives. And so these were instruments that we designed with a very, very affordable box. It's like $1,500 instead of $250,000 to measure air quality on the street. Now, the reason I put this up is because it turned into a public campaign. So you have, on the one hand, people desperate. They have to get about and they mix the fuel and then they create the smoke. But it's quite extraordinary that if you go out and you do surveys and you ask people about air quality, they haven't ever had the educational training or thinking given to them of the link between what they do with fuel, what comes out of the pipe, and what they're breathing. It's quite extraordinary. You would think it would be so obvious, but actually it isn't. And similarly, burning rubbish on the side of the road. if you smell it, it's horrible. It smells of plastic. It's disgusting. But they don't link that with an impact on their health. However, it only took a couple of big campaigns with the television on the roadside and the newspapers picking up when these data, which were rather modest, 6 stations were picked up, and they looked at all the gases and they looked at essentially the source apportionment of where pollutants were coming from, for the public in Nairobi to say, right, that's it, we want clean transport, we want to close certain parts of the city, we're going to do the big experiment just to prove, in fact, that this is killing us. So it didn't take a great deal. And then the question came to the city officials, well, how do we fix it? What do we do? Because if you've only got a certain number of roads and you've got hundreds and hundreds of cars that all use those small roads, of course you have congestion. And then you're back to the picture that I gave you there. And I think now we finally have enough data, enough health data, to demonstrate the link within a city like Nairobi that has finally broken it, so that there is a public debate about how public transport should operate and how people need to have clean air and what the density of traffic will be. But don't take public discourse for granted. That's the first thing. So the second thing is about land. If you really want to deal with a natural prosperity as a driving force for an economy, you go back to how effectively we're using our land. The soils, the nutrients that go into the plants that come from it. 30 to 40% is essentially for plant production all around the planet. But, unfortunately, at least 1/4 of all the world's soils have got to a point where they're so degraded that they simply don't have the nutrient quality that you need to deliver up food that is fit for purpose, in other words, to create a healthy diet. How do we change that? Well, it really means coming back to farmers. It means coming back to, in this case here, I know people are moving towards no-till. But again, there's a huge, huge lack of knowledge about what soil structures are. If I quickly move on to some other trends, tipping points, something that was discussed quite some time ago. Actually, it's worth going back and revisiting them because they are all moving inexorably towards their tipping points, if I can be honest. But I want to draw your attention to this graph on the right-hand side, and just to give you a stacking up of the colours. So the one at the bottom, the geophysical, the red, pretty much stays the same. Then you see the beginnings of sort of meteorological storms, somehow increasing compared to back in the 80s. But the big hit is coming from the hydrological, from the floods, and then to a certain extent from the climatological issues. So when you think about floods, you then have to understand that nearly every flood has this enormous problem afterwards where the soils have been swept away, and often the farmers have essentially lost the means for production. They've lost the very fabric of what they're trying to do. So as we see the increasing incidence of these floods and different events, what you're really looking at is a loss of the capability of people to produce food in a sustainable way. Then there are other things that come upon us. There's a great website which you can go to by Carbon Briefing, and they've calculated and show also the trend, the historical trend all around the world of heating. And it's not too bad. I mean, okay, it's only 3.4, it's not 1.5, but it's 3.4 degrees going forward. Unfortunately, just about 1,000 kilometers to the east, it's already going up to 6.4 degrees. So you're in the Baltic and the Russian side of things. So that's not great news. But anyway, do go and have a look at it. But what this is bringing, and this was just one of many, many, many different incidences of invasive species coming in and actually going to the very fabric of what keeps Scotland, in a sense, on the good side of the curve, which is its forests, its ability to sequester carbon. And so when you see the kind of impact between climate change, global heating, the impact on soils, the ability then for microbes and viruses and others to get into the system, to then take out the very thing that you're relying on to keep carbon dioxide and to actually sequester carbon, then you understand that all of these things are interconnected. So whilst Scotland has an amazingly high natural capital account, in this dynamic world, it's actually eroding, but eroding silently and very quietly. So one needs to have, and this is why the Macaulay and the James Hutton Institute are doing the right kind of work, because this is precisely where some of the problems are going to arise. this all adds up then to a whole range of vulnerabilities. And I think what I want to kind of conclude on here is that unless we take and pay attention to these vulnerabilities, we simply won't build the kind of prosperous future that we want. So when I think about, I'm just not making the slides go forward. Here we go. So when I think about what it looks like, there are people who believe that they're living in this paradise and everything is going very well, but actually we see more and more places that are vulnerable because food is not actually ending up in the place where they need it, i.e. in the home. So the paradise lost means that we just aren't getting it. And so we come to the very core of, if you want to build natural prosperity into our thinking, you have to bring this idea of social and ecological resilience with it. And resilience means, can you withstand those shocks, those tipping points, those increases in the numbers of different events, the floods, the loss of your soils and so forth. And if you don't, actually your chances of making prosperous decisions in the future will be taken away from you. In a place like Kenya, it's just like a catalogue of crises. You just get over the flood and then somebody dies, which then means you have to use the money that you were going to put into your farm for the funeral. And then when that happens, along comes the fact that your cattle have died. So there's this spiralling down, which means that virtually no households have got any insurance. So again, we're opening ourselves up to all kinds of ways in which resilience, really being at the core, is being eroded away by all these different risks. So when we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, actually our coping strategies are telling us that more and more people are moving into a highly stressful health situation, and it's not just one event, it's the catalogue of events that are all connected together. So there's a lovely saying, every adversity, every failure, every heartache carries with it the seed of an equal or greater benefit. And that's not fatalism, but it's just saying, how can we move out of this cascading way of where every single event seems to lead to less and less ability to cope, and take us from there into a way where we can build on that. So East London, literally you take away the means for people to build the prosperous future. And I would say that more often than not in an African setting, unless it's because of war, there's much, much more capacity and ability and opportunity to build that future. So we come to Industry 4.0. This will not be a quiet revolution because it's about not just automation, it's actually about the fact that we're going to have customization. So this is possibly the biggest opportunity that Africa and other parts of the developing world will have, and possibly Scotland as well. So humans are not very good at doing repetitive things, so you give that to robots. I'm sorry, that's what they should be doing, okay? So what does it leave the rest of us to do? Well, we will move into a customized world. And the evidence is very clear. I mean, I have a pair of glasses, quite like the ones I have, but they're not the same as Colin's, and they're not the same as anybody else's in the room. So wouldn't it be great if I could just simply go into my local little shop, my 3D printing shop, and say I would like these frames, and please would you make them now for me? Not have to travel to London to go and get my glass frames. Well, that's in principle how we will be developing in the future. That means that every part of the world, remember IKEA, is going to be looking at a future where that kind of creativity and that customization will become the norm rather than the mass production. It just simply is clear that the mass production that we've had in the past will not fit and suit the kinds of economies that are now coming up the scale, particularly, as I say, in Latin America and in Africa. And to do that, we need to have data. We need to understand from big data and from little data, small data, precisely what it is that people want and how to connect into the value chains. We also need to know about where people are in this whole framework. So how do we shape behaviours? How do we take them to make more naturally prosperous decisions about what they're consuming, as opposed to looking at large-scale production? If you go into many traditional places, we have sustainable food systems. There may not be a lot of food, but it is ultimately one of the most healthy diets you can have. So you can have food that is modest, but it's meat or it's vegetation, which has a very, very high nutrient capacity content. But creeping stealthily up onto Europe are things like aflatoxin and other plant toxins because of climate change. And so we now see that this combination of climate and malnutrition come together because aflatoxin, which is essentially a contaminant of many of our foods coming into Europe, will present a greater and greater risk to foods within Europe. So it's about spreading toxins and bringing those into our marketplaces. What can we do about it? Well, in fact, we can simply we can actually try to tackle it at source, where we hold food and so forth. But what is very worrying is that in places, particularly around the world, where the holding facilities for food is less good, we can see it now linked to a whole range of cancers. So this has genuine consequences for early life, for loss of life expectancy, but it is now spreading. So before you start spraying everywhere and trying to get rid of aflatoxin, you need to find out the extent of the problem. It turns out that just on my doorstep, 41% of the children were found to have aflatoxin poisoning, just because of the maize that they store. Do you stop maize going into the marketplace? No, but obviously you need to have diagnostics that will pick this up early so that people, in fact, do not get contaminated food. So a lot of research on that, on detection and trying to pick that up very early. So now I go to the other side, which is if you want to tackle undernutrition, you really have to understand that if you have a choice of eating a piece of mouldy corn or not eating anything at all, you're obviously going to eat it. So there are significant choices every day between quality of food. But what some plants are doing is also adapting to climate change by turning on genes that makes them poisonous. So some plants are producing prussic acid, which makes them actually poisonous for humans and livestock. Again, a little known fact that just picked up by a very small incident in Ethiopia, and now we know it's a widespread phenomenon. So I'm now just going to quickly turn to the effects of malnutrition on society. 20 million children suffer from severe acute malnutrition, but 46% of deaths are due to that. If you look at the statistics, they're staggering. And what we see now more and more is that often it's not the quantity of food. FAO often gets into camps and gives and makes available essentially packs of food. But contextually, a lot of people don't eat it. And so we see these two types of malnutrition, undernutrition in many parts of the world. And it's not that there isn't food always there. What I want to point to, though, is the development of the brain, because you see on the top what happens to a child that doesn't receive the right kind of nutrition as well as the undernutrition. They have a lot of occlusions in the cells, in the brain, and then you can recover it if you feed them well in the first 1,000 days. What is the most worrying is the one to the bottom right-hand side, which is studies that have been done in places like the US, where they see the same phenomena with very poor families. So you don't have to be in Africa to have a brain that lacks cognitive development. And what that leads to, unfortunately, are children who have a very, very strongly, a very poor executive set of capabilities, executive functions. What does that look like? Well, if you're 15 years old and you get put into a situation which is highly uncertain, you will react violently. You won't actually have the self-restraint. And so the question we ask again and again is, well, if we don't tackle malnutrition and we don't get highly nutritious food into children in their first 1,000 days, is there any way of getting it back? And we do think so. We think there's a way with artificial intelligence to work on cognitive development, to bring those young adults back into a place where they can actually have the kind of cognitive development that means that they will not end up necessarily in violent situations. Because what we really want is for people to have the ability to fight off infections of all kinds. And whether it's a whole range of antimicrobials for which we now see resistance, there's a whole range of nasty things. But this is kind of like the daily world I live in with the TB and everything else. It's not a very pleasant world to live in. And if you read, this is a quote from Fleming when he kind of discovered penicillin, but if you read about how most of our antibiotics were formed, it did come from nature. This is sort of a natural treasure trove. But in the end, we've literally shot ourselves in the foot by poorly using them. As I'm sure most of you will know, the fact that we can have horizontal transfer between bacteria, it means that we're just building up more and more of this resistance. And we actually do quite a lot to harm ourselves through the way in which we treat wastewater. So it's an endless story. What is the solution? Well, we can see already that the way that we're using drugs in the human setting is leading to this massive resistance around the world. So there is a series of things that are done. And there's the sort of, again, the high end and the low end. Here is what I would call the industrial solution. The bacteriophage, my enemy's enemy is my friend. Bacteriophages will, basically target bacteria and kill them. And you can have them injected into you. They've done it in Ukraine, in Russia, and many other places. And we're beginning to have those therapies considered here. But you can also go out in nature and go to the natural store cupboard to what is known as sustainable medicines. And here there's at least 20 that we've worked on, where we've extracted and screened literally antibacterial agents that are more potent than many of the things we have coming through the normal pharmaceutical world. So natural prosperity, again, means that we've kept our ecosystems in a good and healthy way so that store cupboard is available for the kind of situations we find ourselves in. And it's real. This is not just something that is a passing fad. So how do we bring this all together? Well, yesterday we had a great meeting with something called We All Scotland, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So creating places where we can have those kinds of discussions, where we have policy action coming out of leadership that doesn't necessarily have to be political leadership, can be coming from communities, but where we need to have the ideas of new solutions, but those are grounded very much in the environment and in nature. So we need diplomacy. We need to link people into these different networks so they have the ideas and they can transfer them. We have new networks building up. There's a network of government scientific advisors. There's a network of African science diplomacy. So these are all very, very important. And we need to find our place in these networks to carry the knowledge that we have of our local environments into those global discussions. But more and more what we need are to be able to scale these innovative environmental solutions. So we have data solutions, but we have to deploy them in a way which means that we can generate the kinds of changes we're looking for. So they could be as simple as a waste to bio. This is a very, very simple kind of technology, but when you scale it up, has an enormous impact, has mitigation impacts, and makes a real difference on the ground. We can introduce, for example, solar energy in off-grid. This, again, with the right kind of financial levers, is making a huge difference. And what is fascinating is where it's being combined with growing aloe veras and many other medicinal plants. And it's the combinations of technologies that are making livelihoods. It's not just simply having energy, it's the combination of the energy with a different kind of approach to, let's say, farming. It's about connecting people. Here's a way of bringing people close to nature, but where people are prepared to pay for it in a very different way. So the inventiveness is about harnessing and using nature, but really calling on our deeper self to understand instinctually how we build prosperity that doesn't lead to inequity with all the stresses and the health problems, that doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of environmental impacts, but if there are, they are definitely dealt with at source. But in the end, gives us a very different numeraire that ties up all of the Sustainable Development Goals. Instead of just saying, I'm going to take care of goal 14 or number 15 or number 2 or number 1 or number 3, actually they're all integrated together. And having a kind of sense that our interdependency with nature is what's going to deliver in the end, is, I think, possibly one of the greatest revolutions that we still need to achieve. It doesn't mean going back into becoming all subsistence farmers, far from it. But what it does mean is that we have to have a greater respect and a greater understanding scientifically, intellectually, and actually socially of how much we really, really do depend on nature. And to be able to have data and knowledge to act is in principle what science and what informatics can do, whether it's satellites, whether it's air quality monitoring units, or whether it's simply talking to somebody who knows about nature and understands the very functioning and how that can genuinely benefit your own lives. So they have a wonderful saying in Africa. It's about, if you want to go somewhere quickly, go on your own, but if you want to go a long way, go with a lot of people. And I add to that, you can't do things on your own. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. That was a tour de force, in fact, a grand tour of natural prosperity. Hi, everyone. Welcome again. I'm Fran van Dijk, and I have the huge privilege of being the chair of the Macaulay Development Trust. And we look after the kind benefaction of TB Macaulay in order that we can host this event every year. And also, if you go upstairs and have a look at some of the research work that's been done, we're very lucky to be able to support that too. I'm sure you came here expecting to learn a lot. I have been blown away by the information, thinking, and actually just revelation of Jackie's talk today. I had expected to hear about nature and redistribution. Combinatorial knowledge was a new one for me, and I think we can use that in all sorts of ways, not just understanding nature, but understanding communities and emotion. And of course, as Jackie said, making sure that data is accessible and using that to our advantage too. What I wasn't expecting to hear about was mud management. So perhaps you can teach me a bit more of that. But what we're going to do now is engage you in the panel session that's going to happen next. So prepare your questions. We're going to be taking them also from people listening online. I'd like to invite the panel up, please. Colin, Jackie, and Catherine. And while they're coming up, I'll introduce you. You know Colin and you know Jackie. Catherine is the Knowledge and Policy Lead of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance that Jackie mentioned earlier. And so she'll be giving us lots of insights into what that means at community level. To kick off, I thought I'd ask a couple of questions and then take yours. So once again, thanks, Jackie. And I would really like to hear from Colin and from Catherine in no particular order. What were the highlights you took out of Jackie's talk this evening?
Yeah, okay. Hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, like yourself, I mean, it was a real tour de force, and there were many aspects that were coming through. And I think it's one of the difficulties, and I, speaking as a scientist in an institute which is also interested in technological innovations, sometimes you can come up with the most wonderful technological innovations and people don't accept them. Because they're naturally suspicious of those technological innovations, and that's a persistent problem. We can't always innovate our way out of things, and I think one of the things I was expecting to hear and I did hear was the role of actually working with people to devise a solution. That's something at the James Hutton Institute we also really fundamentally believe in, is working with people to try and devise those solutions. I think some of the things you were talking about were really quite staggering in terms of the ability to actually model this dynamic Earth that we do live on. And I was just thinking, what would James Hutton do if he was sitting here today and saw this enormous amount of data coming out? And again, I mean, scientists are very good at producing data, and we sometimes translate that into information, and sometimes we translate that information into knowledge. But actually, what we're all seeking is wisdom. And actually, a lot of people in the ground working in what are fairly sustainable systems actually have the wisdom, but they don't have the connection back to the data, information and knowledge, and I think we don't sometimes appreciate how data, knowledge and information and wisdom are actually connected, and I think there's a lot more to do in that area. I'm always optimistic actually. I mean, I think the world is facing huge problems and challenges, and one of the technological things that we're starting to look at is something called vertical farming. And this is all about using LED light technology, artificial intelligence, robotics, many of the things that you are describing in the coming to us in the Industry 4.0. And again, what you see sometimes people get suspicious. This is more intensive farming. It's actually not. It's actually about still using natural assets such as renewable energy, using water, and using germplasm, crop germplasm, to have a more sustainable way of operating. And because it's a containerized system, you actually avoid the use of pesticides, insecticides, and you can use less fertilizers. But trying to get out of that story still has difficulties in the way people perceive technological solutions. But one of the reasons I mention this, because I think it's incredibly important actually, is because of a lot of the environmental degradation that you described. Actually, there could come a day when we need things like vertical farming, which is independent of climate, which is becoming very unreliable, and it's independent of land, which is becoming very scarce. And so I think these kind of technologies are incredibly important. There's a lot of problems still to solve, and institutes like ourselves will want to do the research to help do that. But there might come a time when actually soil is so precious that we can't afford to use it for making food. We actually need to keep it for biodiversity and for filtering our water and for controlling greenhouse gas emissions. So I think we do need to think very, very differently about things, and I was very stimulated by many, many things that Jackie said. And my favourite photograph was actually somebody shaking hands with a lion. So,
Catherine.
So, Colin, I'm surprised that you didn't talk about the need for the 3D glasses printing, because Colin's glasses are very broken. So I'm surprised that wasn't one of your highlights. But it's interesting, actually, as you as a scientist picking up quite different things, as myself as a political economist. And what I really held on to was one of your points at the very, very beginning around the need for co-benefits and multiple benefits. And I think that there is so much information out there. There are so many ideas. There are so many good policies. And the tricks that I think is sort of the next holy grail is to connect them in a way that we get really beautiful and powerful ripple effects. And I think Scotland is doing that in some instances really brilliantly, and then in other instances some of the internal contradictions in some of the policy programs just make you put your head in your hands. I would say, though, not to the extent that my home country of Australia does, and I've just been home, where they're experiencing the worst drought in a generation. The whole entire state of New South Wales is under drought. And what does Australia do? It goes and opens another coal mine. And so the idea of understanding just how these different pieces are fitting together, I think, is something, that's the sort of policy making that we need for the 21st century. And the challenge there is I think, really, really well made. Perhaps inevitably, given the work I do, the point around prosperity being not just about money. We cannot talk about that enough. But I think very powerfully the way, Jackie, you linked it to the need to be in nature and just how innately human that need is. And I was thinking about how I wonder if in Kenya the socioeconomic gradient in terms of time in nature is probably the reverse to what it is in Scotland. In Scotland, that socioeconomic gradient means that folks on lower income are much less likely to access green space once a week. And I suspect that's almost sort of a direct reversal of the situation in Kenya. And this idea of business unusual, I think, is really, really exciting. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance is working with a lot of pioneering businesses that are so extraordinarily exciting and inspiring in what they're doing and using the vehicle of commercial viability and profit making, but just as a vehicle rather than just the destination. And the destination is social and environmental progress. And the more we can get businesses to be part of that conversation, then we can really start to achieve something really exciting. But when you come back to give your third TB Macaulay lecture, I would like you not to have to use the phrase business as unusual. I would like you to be able to say that sort of business is now usual. That's now the mainstream. I also just finally was really struck by the example of the satellite and the European Space Agency as perhaps an all too rare example of governments collaborating, not just together, but for the long term. I mean, the fact it took 20 years to development, that straddles many, many different political administrations. And the more we have examples of that, then we can start to really address some of these very hairy challenges that you outlined.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one more question and then it's over to you. And really it relates to that connectedness that we were talking about of the ecosystem, social life, economic life, nature, and as well as sort of space, land, data, people, stories. And that really, I think, is encapsulated in the Sustainable Development Goals, which you brought up a couple of times, Jackie, and is our roadmap, really, to a sustainable future if we engage with them successfully. And I think the big word there is if, even though it's a small word. And what we've got is civil society, business, governments, and academia all thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals and taking them on. But how are we really going to get traction? I'd love to hear from you. What is it going to take to get people to really measure progress and do business unusual with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals rather than simply aligning existing activities to what they are? And I'd love to hear from you, Jackie, where you think they should be going in terms of measurement and progress.
I saw the Sustainable Development Goals really from the very beginning, and at the time I was the chief statistician in UN Environment, leading then on the sort of the environment pillar, which even sounds weird having to say that. To give them their due, the statisticians and others who were tasked with the job of measuring, because progress needs to be measured and so on and so forth, they did open their minds to a whole raft of new things. And Earth observation, which I considered to be the no-brainer, was the big revolution. But they then said, we're going to do spatially disaggregated indicators, gender disaggregated indicators. Well, actually, that's a really interesting revolution, because it suddenly means that you sitting in your house are now as relevant in terms of a data point as any other part of the planet Earth, as opposed to when it's all scooped up into one average. And so there's a conversation to be had now. And I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember Local Agenda 21?
Yes.
Anyone remember that? Hands up? Yes, right. There are still groups all over the world still meeting as the LA 21 groups. And they're having a great time because they've been doing it all this time. But in a way, that's what we want. We want, essentially, communities not to say we're going to adopt the SDGs, but to figure out, well, what does it look like from my local perspective? What is prosperity? And what's the outcome that we're after? And frankly, you've been given a voice. So I'm always, whenever I go anywhere, I say, speak. Here's the space. And so I would hope that, a community as vibrant and as engaged as all of you can take home the message, well, actually, I need to go and take the UK Space Agency to task. I want to learn how to use the data that will tell me at the scale of 30 centimetre resolution just how the land around me is evolving. So I think this demand-led process could genuinely create the kind of local revolution that we need and that engagement. And then you write your own menu, you write your own, put your ingredients in and come out with what you think sustainable development and prosperity should look like.
Thank you. Catherine, what's your recipe for these ingredients?
Well, I think to pick up on that, one of the best things about the SDGs is the fact that they did emerge from massive citizen consultation through the World We Want and the My World survey. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of people were part of the deliberation that start to coalesce into the 18 goals. And what people said was remarkably similar across countries, across cultures, across age groups, across education backgrounds. And the top three were an honest, responsive government, better education, and better healthcare. And the fact that these sort of fairly basics of life, I mean, if you, in one sense, pretty humble ambitions for people. I mean, these are not people who are shooting for sort of huge material palaces and amazing sports cars. These are people who are wanting just the very basics of life so their family can get on with living and spending time with each other and feeling secure. And so the fact that the SDGs speak to that and took the time and the effort to go out and speak to people, I think is really vital, and reflects also the extraordinarily, I think, quite beautiful mantra that underpins all of the SDGs, and that's around this idea of leave no one behind. Mm-hmm. And I mean, we might talk about triple bottom line or the sort of the multiple bottom line if businesses are adhering to all the goals, but actually that is the only bottom line that we need. this idea that no one is left behind, because in a world of such huge material wealth but a resource-constrained world, this idea of sharing and better distributing what we've already got, and perhaps even entertaining a conversation that, given the very real resource constraints, maybe we need to have a conversation that maybe some people are just too far ahead. And yes, that might be a difficult conversation, but when it is quite literally taking away ecological space for others to increase their material living standards, and that's the conversation we need, that the SDGs enables. The other, I think, quite extraordinary aspect to the SDGs that hasn't quite been taken on board by governments in the global north is that they are for everyone. And the extent, and this is one of the huge contrasts to the Millennium Development Goals, is that they're so universal across the world, and no country can get out of that conversation. And work that's been done by the Bertelsmann Foundation was mapping how the OECD countries are achieving the SDGs or not. And the emphasis is on the or not, because some of these countries might tick some of the boxes and the objectives in terms of the social targets, but when you look at their material footprint and their use of resources, then they're failing. And the Bertelsmann Foundation, the author of this report, concludes that no one is developed in that much more holistic sense of the term. So the challenge comes back, I think, to those of us living in the rich global north to really attend to the economic models that are doing so much harm and quite literally ensuring currently that plenty of people are still left behind. So until we sort of shine the light back on us, and the SDGs help us do that.
Colin, I don't want to leave you behind. So,
okay, but I'll be brief. Yeah.
So your take on the measurement piece, or where they should be going?
Well, maybe just follow up on the Sustainable Development Goals, because they're very important to my institute. In fact, we actually chose the Sustainable Goals as the framework to actually describe how our research makes an impact and a contribution, and we try to map our research onto about 11 of the 17 goals. And one of the reasons we did that was because actually one of the things they cracked was the communication side. At the top level, you can't argue with things like zero hunger. They translate to people in a very meaningful way and give you actual motivation and inspiration and the leadership to actually corral the science and the research to actually achieve a very plausible, good goal. And we've found them very unifying and sort of giving us moral leadership as well in terms of what we actually do. And of course they are adopted right across the world by many, the majority of governments. So they're a great way for us as an organisation to actually do work in Scotland that's relevant to Sustainable Development Goals, but also do that in Africa as well. So we're big fans of them for that, partly just because of this communication ability and about unifying people on a common cause, and because it's going to take everybody to actually work together to actually solve these very, very difficult problems.
Thank you. Well, folks, it's over to you. There are some roving mics. Would you like to put your hand in the air if you want to ask a question? If it's for anyone in particular, please say who it's for. Otherwise, we'll let the panel decide amongst themselves who's best to answer. Right, we've got a couple at the back. There's a gentleman on my right there, and one on the left. Behind you.
Thank you very much. Hello. Tom Mason, MSP, North East of Scotland.
I don't think your mic's on.
Hello.
Sorry, I think we have the technology now. Tom Mason, MSP for North East of Scotland. Enjoyed your lecture, and it did what a good lecture should do, simplify and exaggerate, which leaves us with a no-brainer. We've got a situation where we need to do something, but we have a long way to go. Do you think we have enough time to get there? And are we going to lose some of our natural liberties on the way through?
Very good point.
Thank you. We'll take one more question, and then we'll take those two together.
Hi, Cathy Baldwin, University of Oxford and University of Glasgow. What is the likelihood of economists and academics persuading government ministers that they need to make decisions that are not driven by neoliberal and economic growth style values, but are indeed driven by values of sustainability, planetary health and well-being, not being measured in terms of GDP? Recently there was the conference of the Rockefeller Foundation, Lancet, Planetary Health Commission at this very venue, and there was a very nice and interesting indigenous leader from Canada who spoke, but it felt like a token gesture, because back in Oxford, where I sit in a working group of people from the economics-driven Planetary Health Commission on planetary health, the conversation is, how do we influence ministers to make economic decisions in keeping with planetary health, not according to an alternative set of values?
Thank you. I'll come to some more questions later. So we've got a couple of questions there. One is about, do we have enough time? And the other one is, how do we get away from the neoliberal mindset and persuade ministers to take on a much more holistic approach to policy making? Catherine, I'm sure you'd like to take the second one.
Yes, please.
Jackie and Colin, do you want to fight over the first one?
Sure. Very quickly, I think you could say we don't have enough time. We don't have time for everything. What I'm putting to you, though, if we truly understand the interconnectedness, we will make faster gains in areas where we thought we wouldn't. In other words, if you're going in many silos separately, then we'll take a long time to get to certain outcomes. But I just want to touch on the other point, because to be perfectly honest, I think that neoliberalism is alive and well in this country. It's got no detractors as far as I can see in the corridors of power. However, what I'm suggesting is that with natural prosperity, you don't have to constrain yourself to, and this is slightly heresy here, the planetary limits. In fact, if we can create a regenerative economy, one which actually encourages, so to speak, nature to replenish itself in an appropriate way, you can actually make a very strong economic argument for particular actions. And I would love to discuss this with you further, because I do see that the short-sightedness stops because of the accounting and all of the other structures. And if you build in regeneration into your thinking, not only does it help you tell you what you need to do today that will lead to longer term benefits, but it also tells you how acting today in certain ways will have manifestation and positive implications in many other spheres. So it's a different way of doing things, which means that you do it in the much more, joining up the dots right from the very beginning. So we do have time, but not for the kind of past actions that we had in the past.
Colin, time?
Yeah, I want to answer this question directly to begin with, but I will in a minute. What I want to say first is that I'm very optimistic about many of the new approaches that are coming out, and that obviously eats into the time factor to some extent, but the biggest threat to our sustainability is climate change, and we are running out of time, and we do need great and urgent action to actually resolve that. We know that we're not going to reverse some of the effects that we're already seeing today for a very long time, and we do need to make sure that people fully appreciate the urgency required around actions to mitigate and adapt to climate change, because it is going to happen. And we need to be very worried about many parts of the world. Some parts of the world will be affected very badly, and there isn't enough time possibly, unless we're very innovative and take very urgent action. We're actually quite fortunate, I think, in this part of the world in terms of the effects of climate change, but we have a great moral responsibility to many other parts of the world. And so I'm optimistic there's enough time in many parts of the world, but I wouldn't want to mislead people around the urgency for action around climate change.
Catherine?
Yeah, just one quick comment on the first one. I think the very scary reality is that time has already run out for so many people who are already impacted by the effects of climate change. We're seeing these unprecedented heat waves and floods and the deaths that are coming from extreme weather events. So we're sort of past the use-by date on the pressure on the planet. So I mean, we cannot keep faffing and debating the evidence anymore. But Kathy, on your question around political leadership, I guess I'm lucky at the moment in the project I'm working on. It brings me into contact with politicians and policy makers and officials that I would call real pioneers, who I think sadly still against the grain and who are pushing against the grain, but have really recognised that we cannot keep carrying on with business as usual. I mean, that is the ultimate naivety, isn't it, to just think that we can keep going on. and who are saying we need to rejig not only that big, very purpose of what the economy is about and what it's for and how we measure it, but really collaborate and keep competing with each other to try and do things better. And really excited to say that the Scottish Government, and deep in the heart of the economics department in the Scottish Government, is leading a project to connect with other governments around the world who are focusing on policy making for well-being, and that's extraordinarily exciting, and we need to help them because it's very, very difficult. And I was at the same conference back in May, and I thought it was brilliant conference. But one of the other speakers there was the Future Generations Commissioner from Wales, and that post, having a independent individual with her team around her, and having it as a woman, I'd say, is also really helpful. Having that post geared up with her sole purpose to scrutinise policy according to the impact of well-being on current and future generations is the sort of pioneering initiative that we should just be rolling out. In Scotland, we've got to hurry up because Wales has now overtaken Scotland on some of these initiatives, but across the world. And I think they're the sort of initiatives that we can hold on to and we should all be celebrating so that others start to emulate and replicate that.
Thank you. There was a hand right at the very back a while back. Is it still there? One there. And another one, yes, standing up even.
Sam Cook, University of Edinburgh, SRUC. I wanted to go back to the malnutrition idea. So you said that the problem wasn't there was no food, but people weren't eating it. So is that because there is no cultural connect, they don't trust the people giving the food? And also linking towards the United States and the brain damage, are you finding that the people who have the brain damage as children are also overweight because they're just not getting the nutritional value in their food and they're just going for highly processed fast food because it's all they can afford? Thank you.
One more.
George Allison's my name. The question I have is, standing in this room, Scotland's lifting 73 million tonnes of oil out of the North Sea every year. Isn't that the biggest issue that your data points to? Thank you.
So 2 questions there, one around malnutrition, trust, obesity, brain damage, and the other one around oil being our biggest problem here.
There's certainly something called the double burden of malnutrition, which is the two ends, the sort of diabetes, overweight, and that being the cause of many ultimate health disorders coming from malnutrition, in other words, the nutrient content, and then there's the undernutrition. So on the undernutrition, what we see, of course, is just a lack of food. However, the RTUF packs that get sent out to refugee camps, and often in an emergency, I've been in many refugee camps, and what you see is it just doesn't, if it's absolutely the last thing that, children will be given it, absolutely. However, I have seen piles of them sitting there and not being used because culturally and a whole pile of other things means that they're just not available. People just don't use them. If there's a medical team, then they essentially force the pace. But, I live in a community, I live in a village where actually we only eat, on average, food, proper food, every 3 days, 2 to 3 days. And you have milk the rest of the time, and you might have meat maybe once a week, and that's about it. And then in between, there's bits of maybe some rice or some porridge, but there's not very much. So when you're talking about average calories, it's about 400 or 500. However, the children are not malnourished, because what they're gaining is access to all the plants that I was showing, and essentially they have a kind of nutritional value which goes way beyond the number of calories. So they're thin, but they're not malnourished. And in fact, I started to do some MRIs of those children, and we do not see the degree of occlusion that we see in some of the more extreme situations. So I don't think we have all the answers. What I do have is we have a big team now that's looking at this all around the world. The 1,000 days, though, is the window of opportunity, no doubt about it. So I would love to be able to come back sometime in the future with a clear answer about which nutrients. But what we do know is that when the soils are depleted of many nutrients and the food that's coming out of it is equally poor in terms of nutrient status, then you get yourselves into real malnourishment domains, and that's really tricky.
Can perhaps either Catherine or Colin take the thorny oil question?
Yeah, I'll deal with the oil one then. I mean, I'm not going to specifically refer to oil, but I mean, if you're referring to the energy sector, clearly the utilisation of fossil fuels has made a major contribution towards climate change and global warming. But so have lots of other sectors. And clearly we are in a transition away from fossil fuel as an energy source, and I think in Scotland doing very, very well in relation to renewable energy. We do need to transition away from it. And actually, when you look at some of the recent figures around the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, the energy sector has actually been doing quite well, and we're actually picking off all these sort of easy to pick fruit in that respect. And it's going to be a lot harder now to actually get greenhouse gas emissions down from other sectors. And the scrutiny now is, as the government have actually said themselves, is going to be on transport and agriculture in the future. And it's going to be a lot tougher to actually reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And I think we need to look at all sectors at all times. Clearly, that was the biggest offender in terms of the past, but the energy sector has done a lot to transition, and we need the other sectors to do the same.
Jackie, I know you want to add a little something.
Just a tiny thing, and it's coming completely from out of field, all right? So do forgive me. It's not a comment on Scotland, although I have various views on that. But where I live in Kenya, we have an amazing infrastructure with wires, which is bringing coal-fired power plant electricity down, only it doesn't. Because having put all the infrastructure in, they realised that it was going to be way too expensive for the local population to buy in. So we've got wonderful wires, we've got great poles, but it's all empty, and all that infrastructure is going nowhere, and essentially people have turned to microgrids and solar power and entirely renewable. So by the sheer pricing, actually the fossil fuel industry has priced itself out of the energy market. It's a really interesting phenomenon.
Just ever so quickly in reply to George's question around oil, that the second most polluting industry after oil is fashion. And I think both of those being in the spotlight is really key. And I would say North Sea oil, probably not the biggest problem, but perhaps a symptom of what the biggest problem is. And that's a mindset that has put the economy on top of this idea of society and nature, and has positioned a mindset that's positioned society and nature as in service of the economy, rather than seeing the economy as a subset of both. And so I'd say, I guess twist your question a little bit, if I may, George, and suggest that actually it's a symptom of a much bigger problem rather than the problem in and of itself. But I think the fashion sector too, and all its harm to the environment and to human beings, of course, is emblematic of that, I guess, misconstrued, imbalanced mindset.
Thank you. Nicola, do we have some questions from those watching online? Would you want to read a couple out if we do?
Yes, we have a question from Kirsten apologies for pronouncing your name incorrectly, Ragnarstori.
It's Vala. It's Vala.
Our Icelandic presidential candidate.
I would like to learn more about the medicinal plants that is being investigated, and also what effect may they have on local village economies and the health of the local people.
Fascinating question. Jackie, would you like?
Actually, I happen to know the person who's asked the question, and she comes from Iceland, where traditional medicine is alive and well, I can tell you. So, is it a viable livelihood? Absolutely. Is it knowledge that is well understood in the broader community, particularly in Africa? Absolutely. Can you turn it into a kind of an economy? Absolutely, which is why we have huge numbers of companies and individuals from China actually on the ground. And so here's the real tragedy in a way. This knowledge which is used to keep the local populations of people and livestock healthy, and used in a really good way, which is taken fresh, imbibed, prepared, and pretty accurate, I would say, in terms of diagnostics, taking the right plant for the right illness, is kind of cruising along. But what you have is massive prospecting. Now, fortunately, and I'll just say this, it's kind of an interesting thing, Kenya has a really, really powerful constitution which says that if you want to go into the consumptive use of wildlife and they include all plants in that. Every Kenyan citizen must benefit. Wow, isn't that an amazing statement? So nobody has the right to extract anything from the Kenyan wildlife without showing the benefit to the whole of the Kenyan society. They don't have the functionality and the policy instruments to do it, but the mere fact that it's there in the Constitution means that we have, in a sense, the direction to take it. So in answer to your question, Kirsten, I think we can do it. I think we can. This is a kind of real natural prosperity example, and I suspect that there's the store cupboard waiting to solve some of the problems of antimicrobial resistance.
Thank you. Now, we're running a little bit late, but I do want to take one more question, and as it's the year of young people this year, I would like a question from someone who considers themselves to be young. Raise your hand, and yes, there's one there. Someone's fanning themselves, they're feeling really hot. Not.
So I thought the concept of AI was extremely interesting when it comes to trying to resolve issues regarding malhunger and development, but I wonder if the funding that was used for that would be better spent for preventative measures and what the economic viability is of using such things in the future. I think it's something that sounds very cool, but I wonder, like, who is going to be funding AI for the millions of people that are malnourished in the future? That just didn't,
Okay, but then the problem is we have millions of people for whom the 1,000-day door closed. And so I put a very moral question on the table. If we don't do something about those individuals and those people who have been put at risk, the whole of the global population is put at risk, because they will become part of our world. They are part of our world. They're moving around. And it's an unpredictability that essentially needs to be addressed. So whilst I completely agree we should go to the root of the problem, absolutely, you just can't leave people behind. I mean, it's basically what the SDGs are about. And so I think we have a duty of care to those who, for whatever reason, did not have the capacity or weren't given the right kind of nutrients when they were babies or in the womb or when they were born. So I think it's a moral, and I think it's an important question. Really the deeper issue is, can we develop AI in a way which is open and transparent, such that individuals feel that they can engage in it in a way that actually trains the brain, if I can be honest, to do things in a more gentle way. Let me say that.
Something to add?
Just ever so quickly, I'm very sympathetic to your question, this idea of really the need to focus on prevention, and also so how much of the treatment and the fixing actually costs a lot more. But I entirely agree with Jackie that we absolutely need to do both. I've spent almost a decade working for Oxfam, a humanitarian organisation first and foremost. It's about humanitarian intervention, and that to leave folks behind who are struggling to live now is a moral imperative. But that's all we will ever be doing if we do not turn our attention to those upstream root causes. And so the answer is yes, and we absolutely need to be doing both. But I'd say the prevention stuff needs to have come on the table a lot more urgently and with much more vigour of the conversation than it currently is now. We're still stopping in those root causes conversations way too early. We're not going really right upstream enough.
Thank you. Well, with that, the 41st Macaulay Lecture draws to a close, and I would particularly like to thank Nicola and all the people she's been working with who has made this possible and has filled this entire hall, which is a first for us. So thank you very, very, very much, and thank you to our fabulous panel. There are refreshments waiting for you upstairs. We're going to be doing a little bit more down here with photographs, so please make your way upstairs. But first of all, let's show a vote of thanks to our speakers.